The cave's entrance was a jagged maw carved into the mountainside, veiled by a thicket of gnarled trees and moss-strewn boulders. It loomed large and forbidding, as though it were a wound in the earth itself, its edges glistening with condensation that shimmered faintly in the pale morning light. For months, the expedition team had pored over geological surveys and local folklore, lured by the promise of unexplored depths and ancient secrets buried within the labyrinthine caves. Today, their journey began, though none could ignore the faint sense of foreboding that lingered in the crisp mountain air. Dr. Eleanor Frost, the lead geologist and mastermind behind the expedition, stood at the entrance, her clipboard clutched tightly in her gloved hands. She was a woman of science, known for her sharp intellect and sharper tongue. Yet, even she couldn't shake the discomfort gnawing at the edges of her confidence. "This is it," she said, her voice firm but hollow. "We're going to make history." The team consisted of 6 members: Marcus, the veteran caver; Danielle, the eager botanist; Eric, the tech specialist; Samantha, the anthropologist; Oliver, the medic; and Eleanor herself. Each had a specific role, and each harbored their own reasons for joining this risky venture. For Marcus, it was a chance to conquer the unconquerable. For Danielle, the possibility of discovering unknown flora. Eric and his gadgets promised to document every inch of the caves. And for Samantha, whispers of ancient rituals tied to the caves were too tantalizing to ignore. The group began their descent with practiced precision, headlamps slicing through the oppressive darkness. The cave's mouth opened into a narrow passage, the walls slick with moisture and streaked with mineral deposits. Every step was accompanied by the soft crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the distant drip of water echoing from deeper within. It was a soundscape that seemed alive, pulsating with an unseen energy that unnerved even the seasoned Marcus. "Keep your eyes peeled," Marcus called out, his voice steady but laced with caution. "These walls can shift unexpectedly. Last thing we need is someone getting stuck." The air grew colder as they ventured deeper, the sunlight fading into a distant memory. The tunnels widened, revealing vast chambers where stalactites and stalagmites created a maze of natural architecture. The sheer beauty of the formations momentarily eased the tension, but as they pressed on, an eerie silence fell over the group. Even the dripping water seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the sound of their own breaths. Eleanor stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to signal the others. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The team froze, straining their ears. For a moment, there was nothing, only the oppressive weight of silence. Then, faintly, a low, rhythmic hum began to rise from the depths. It wasn't mechanical or natural. It was something else entirely. Danielle shivered, clutching her pack tightly. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eric adjusted his headset, scanning for any anomalies. "Could be a resonance effect," he offered, though his tone lacked conviction. "Caves sometimes amplify external sounds. Could be wind or distant seismic activity." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. She stepped closer to the sound, her flashlight cutting through the dark. The hum seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if calling to her. Her pulse quickened, though she couldn't say whether it was from fear or excitement. "Let's keep moving," she said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. As they ventured deeper, the walls began to close in, narrowing the passage until they were forced to walk single file. The hum followed them, growing fainter at times, but never disappearing entirely. It wasn't until they reached a small chamber that the sound stopped altogether, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Oliver, the medic, broke the silence. "Whatever's down here, we need to be careful. This place isn't just a cave. It's something else. Something alive." No one dared to voice agreement, but the unease was palpable. This was only the beginning of their journey, yet the labyrinth had already made its presence known. As they set up camp for the night, none could shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the cave was studying them just as much as they were exploring it. The team awoke to an unnatural silence, the kind that seemed to press against their ears and fill their minds with unease. Gone were the faint drips of water or the low hum that had followed them the day before. In their place was a void of sound so profound it seemed to amplify every shuffle of a boot or crackle of their small campfire. Even the soft hiss of their breathing felt intrusive in the oppressive stillness. Eleanor was the first to rise, her eyes darting to the surrounding walls. They had camped in a modestly sized chamber, its jagged walls adorned with streaks of mineral deposits that shimmered faintly under their headlamps. Something about those walls had changed overnight, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She brushed off the thought as morning grogginess and roused the others. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Samantha scribbled in her journal, her brow furrowed as she sketched rough outlines of the chamber's features. Marcus inspected his gear meticulously, while Oliver quietly checked their supplies. Danielle, usually the most talkative, sat silently, her gaze fixed on the walls. Eric, ever the skeptic, broke the tension with his usual sarcasm. Well, no boogeymen showed up overnight. I'd say we're off to a good start, he said, his voice echoing faintly. But his words did little to lift the mood. The oppressive silence seemed to swallow his humor, leaving only the unease that had settled over them. As they packed up and prepared to move deeper into the labyrinth, Danielle finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Did anyone hear voices last night? She asked, her eyes darting between the others. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus was the first to respond. Voices? He repeated, his tone skeptical. This deep underground? Must have been your imagination. Danielle shook her head. No, I swear I heard it. It was faint, like whispers coming from the walls. Eleanor frowned, her scientific mind searching for an explanation. It could be an auditory hallucination, she offered. Caves like these can mess with your senses. The silence, the darkness, it plays tricks on your mind. But Samantha didn't look convinced. Hallucinations don't explain why I thought I heard them too, she said, her voice steady but low. I didn't want to say anything, but I swear I heard whispers. Words I couldn't understand. The group fell silent again, the weight of Samantha's confession settling over them like a lead blanket. Marcus dismissed it with a wave of his hand, muttering something about hysteria, but the others weren't so quick to brush it off. As they began their trek deeper into the caves, an air of paranoia took hold, each member casting furtive glances at the walls as if expecting them to suddenly speak. The tunnels seemed narrower today, the darkness denser. Their flashlights barely cut through the oppressive black, and every step echoed unervingly, as though something unseen were following them. The mineral streaks in the walls took on a strange, almost organic appearance, resembling veins pulsating with some hidden life force. It was Danielle who noticed it first. She stopped abruptly, shining her flashlight on a patch of wall that seemed different from the rest. Here, she said, her voice trembling. Look at this. The others gathered around her, their lights converging on the spot. At first, it appeared to be another mineral deposit, but as they looked closer, they saw shapes, patterns etched into the stone. They were faint but unmistakable, symbols, spirals, and what looked like crude humanoid figures. These weren't here before, Samantha said, her voice tight. Eleanor leaned closer, her scientific curiosity momentarily overtaking her fear. These could be ancient carvings, she said, running her gloved fingers over the markings. But how did we miss them yesterday? Marcus stepped back, his jaw tight. I don't like this. Let's keep moving. The deeper we go, the worse it's going to get. But as they resumed their journey, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't faint. They weren't distant. They were clear, as if coming from just behind the team, low and guttural and unmistakably real. For the first time, no one tried to explain it away. Whatever was down here, it wasn't the product of their imagination. The labyrinth wasn't just alive, it was aware, and it had started speaking. The whispers had stopped abruptly, as if the caves themselves had decided to hold their breath. The group stood frozen, their flashlights casting long, jittering shadows across the uneven walls. No one dared to move. Every sound seemed amplified. The shifting of a backpack, the faint crackle of a battery in a headlamp, even the sound of their own hearts pounding in their ears. The silence wasn't comforting, It was predatory, an unseen force waiting for them to let their guard down. Eleanor broke the spell. "Keep moving," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Stay close. No one wanders off." The team shuffled forward, their pace slow and deliberate. The walls seemed to press in tighter with every step, their surfaces taking on an almost fleshy texture. Samantha paused occasionally to take photos, though her hands trembled so much that most of her shots were blurry. Marcus, leading the group, began to mutter under his breath. A prayer, maybe, or a litany to drown out the oppressive silence. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, to the point where each exhalation became visible as a ghostly puff of mist. Eric, ever the tech enthusiast, pulled out a thermal scanner, frowning as the readings danced erratically. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. The temperature dropped sharply ahead, but there's no reason for it. No drafts, no underground water flow. It's just cold. "That's not all that strange," Danielle said, her voice tight. She shone her flashlight on the walls, revealing more of the strange carvings they'd seen earlier. Only now, they were more numerous and more intricate. The humanoid figures seemed to writhe and twist, their crude forms caught in silent torment. "What are these?" Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Petroglyphs, maybe," Eleanor replied, though her tone lacked its usual certainty. "Or something older. But this style doesn't match anything I've seen before. It's unsettling." Unsettling was an understatement. The figures weren't just etched into the stone. They seemed to bulge out of it, as though struggling to escape the confines of the rock. One in particular caught Danielle's eye, a tall, skeletal figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that its eyeless gaze was fixed directly on her. "Can we stop staring at the creepy art and keep moving?" Marcus barked, his frustration masking his fear. The group pushed on, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was tangible, like an invisible weight pressing against their backs. Danielle swore she saw something move in the corner of her vision, but when she turned, there was nothing but darkness. Then it happened. Samantha let out a sharp gasp, dropping her flashlight. The beam flickered wildly as it hit the ground, casting erratic patterns across the cavern walls. "Something touched me," she exclaimed, clutching her arm. Marcus spun around, his own flashlight scanning the space behind them. "There's nothing there," he growled, but his eyes betrayed his words. "I felt it," Samantha insisted, her voice rising. "It wasn't my imagination. It was cold, like a hand." Eleanor knelt beside her, examining her arm. There were no visible marks, but Samantha's skin was ice cold to the touch. "Let's keep moving," Eleanor said firmly, though she couldn't hide the quaver in her voice. "We'll deal with this later." The group pressed on, but the tension was palpable. The darkness felt thicker now, almost tactile. Their flashlights seemed weaker, their beams swallowed by the void. And then came the sound, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. "Who's there?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing down the tunnel. No answer came, only the sound of the footsteps growing closer. Panic began to set in. They quickened their pace, their boots slipping on the uneven ground. The footsteps followed, unrelenting, always just out of sight. Danielle tripped, letting out a small cry as she hit the ground. Marcus hauled her up, but her flashlight had skidded away, its beam illuminating something far ahead. The group froze. At the edge of the light stood a figure, a silhouette darker than the surrounding shadows. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply stood watching. "Run," Eleanor whispered. And they did, plunging headlong into the labyrinth, the whispers returning to chase them. Shadows clung to the walls, alive and breathing, as the labyrinth revealed its true nature. The caves were no longer just a place. They were a predator, and the team had become its prey. The group didn't stop running until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out beneath them. They skidded into a wide chamber, its ceiling arcing high above them, like the dome of a cathedral. Here, the oppressive closeness of the tunnels gave way to an eerie expanse, but the space was far from comforting. The walls were lined with jagged stalactites, their shadows resembling rows of teeth in the dim, flickering light of their flashlights. Eleanor doubled over, clutching her knees as she gasped for air. The others followed suit, their breathing ragged and shallow. The echoes of their hurried footsteps bounced back at them from all directions, creating a cacophony of sound that made it impossible to tell where they had come from, or if they were still being followed. What was that? Danielle managed between breaths, her voice trembling. I don't know, Eleanor admitted, wiping sweat from her brow. It looked human, but it wasn't. Not entirely. Eric, who had been unusually silent, spoke up, his voice sharp with panic. That thing, whatever it is, it's not just following us. It's hunting us? We don't know that. Marcus snapped, though his wide eyes betrayed his own fear. It could have been a shadow, a trick of the light. We're all tired and seeing things. It wasn't a trick, Samantha interjected, her tone cold and certain. I saw it too. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. The words sent a shiver through the group. No one wanted to admit it, but Samantha's observation rang true. Whatever they had seen, or thought they'd seen, it hadn't moved like a shadow or a hallucination. It had moved like a predator sizing up its prey. The chamber offered a temporary reprieve, but it was clear they couldn't stay. Samantha was the first to notice the strange acoustics of the space. Every noise they made, every word, every shuffle, seemed to ripple outward, distorting as it bounced back to them. At first it was subtle, but as they listened, the echoes began to sound wrong. What is that? Danielle asked, her voice rising as she turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source of the distortion. It's the echoes, Eric said, his face pale. They're changing. Indeed, the sounds that returned to them were no longer perfect replicas of their own voices. Instead, the echoes carried an unnatural cadence, stretching words, distorting syllables, and adding whispers that hadn't been spoken. Stop talking, Eleanor ordered, her voice barely above a whisper. Just listen. The group fell silent, but the echoes continued. Faint at first, then louder. The sound seemed to mimic their previous conversations, as though the chamber itself were replaying fragments of their fear. And then something new emerged. Among the distorted echoes was a voice none of them recognized. It was low and guttural, speaking in a language none of them understood. The sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from deep within the chamber, from somewhere ahead. Do you hear that? Samantha asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Eleanor replied, her eyes fixed on the dark expanse before them. It's calling. Calling for what? Danielle asked, her voice cracking. For us, Eric said grimly, his flashlight trembling in his hands. As the group stood frozen, the temperature in the chamber plummeted. Their breath puffed out in white clouds, and a faint vibration began to pulse through the ground beneath their feet. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was echoing inside their skulls. Move, Eleanor said urgently. Now! They turned toward the nearest tunnel and began to run, the echoes growing into a deafening roar behind them. But the chamber wasn't done with them yet. Just as they reached the mouth of the tunnel, the ground beneath Samantha's feet gave way with a sickening crack. She let out a scream as she disappeared into the darkness, the sound of her fall swallowed by the unrelenting echoes. Samantha! Danielle cried, dropping to her knees and reaching out for the void where her friend had stood. Keep moving! Marcus shouted, dragging Danielle to her feet. We can't help her if we're dead too. The group plunged into the tunnel, their flashlights barely illuminating the way forward. Behind them, the chamber roared, the guttural voice blending with the echoes in a crescendo of rage. And as they ran, a chilling realization settled over them. The labyrinth wasn't just alive. It was watching, listening, and now it was taking them one by one. The group stumbled blindly through the winding tunnels, their fear and exhaustion propelling them forward. Samantha's scream still echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder of how quickly the labyrinth could claim them. Marcus led the way, his flashlight beam darting ahead, but the darkness seemed infinite, absorbing the light as if mocking their efforts to escape. Danielle was inconsolable, her quiet sobs breaking the heavy silence. Eleanor tried to comfort her, but her own mind churned with guilt and panic. Samantha had been her responsibility, and now she was gone, swallowed by the caves without a trace. "We have to go back for her," Danielle insisted, her voice hoarse. "She's gone," Marcus snapped, not looking back. "If we stop, we'll all be gone too. That doesn't mean we abandon her," Danielle shouted, wrenching free of Marcus's grip. Eleanor stepped between them, raising her hands to calm the situation. "Enough," she said firmly. "We don't know what happened to Samantha. She could still be alive, but we can't help her if we're lost or dead ourselves. We need to find a safe place, regroup, and think this through." Her words carried weight, and the others reluctantly nodded. Even Marcus, though his jaw remained clenched, didn't argue further. They pressed on, moving slower now, their flashlights casting uneasy shadows on the walls. The carvings that had been scattered along the tunnels were now everywhere, etched into nearly every surface. The humanoid figures were more grotesque, their bodies twisted in unnatural poses. Some appeared to be clawing at unseen barriers, while others reached out as if in supplication. Eleanor stopped abruptly, her flashlight fixed on one particular carving. It was larger than the others, spanning nearly the entire height of the tunnel wall. The figure was unmistakably humanoid, but grotesquely elongated, its arms stretching unnaturally long, its face devoid of features except for a gaping, hollow mouth. "What is this?" she murmured, running her fingers lightly over the rough surface. "It's like the others," Eric said, though his voice wavered. "But bigger, more detailed. It's not just a carving," Eleanor said, her voice distant as if speaking to herself. "It's a warning." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, like a distant vibration, but it quickly escalated into a violent quake. The group stumbled, clutching the walls for balance as loose stones rained down from above. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very rock around them. It wasn't just a noise. It was a presence, deep and primal, and it filled the tunnel with a suffocating sense of dread. "We have to move," Marcus shouted, grabbing Danielle's arm and pulling her forward. But just as they began to run, the tremors stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the tunnel. The group froze, their breath shallow, as they listened for any sign of what might come next. And then, a voice echoed through the darkness. Not a guttural growl like before, but a soft, melodic whisper. It spoke in a language none of them understood, yet its tone was unmistakably commanding. "What is that?" Eric asked, his voice barely audible. "It's not coming from behind us," Eleanor said, her flashlight trembling as she pointed it ahead. "It's in front." As the light swept forward, it illuminated a figure standing in the tunnel. At first glance, it appeared human, but as the beam steadied, the truth became apparent. The figure was skeletal, its flesh barely clinging to its bones, and its hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light. The group recoiled, their instincts screaming at them to run, but the figure raised a hand, palm outward, as if commanding them to stay. The melodic whisper grew louder, resonating within their minds. "It's speaking to us," Danielle said, her voice trembling with both fear and fascination. "Don't listen," Marcus shouted, pulling her back. But it was too late. Danielle stepped forward, her eyes wide and glassy, as if entranced. The figure's hollow gaze locked onto hers, and the whispering seemed to shift, taking on a tone of invitation. "No!" Eleanor screamed, lunging to grab Danielle, but the skeletal figure moved faster. With a sudden, inhuman speed, it reached out and touched Danielle's forehead with a single bony finger. Danielle let out a sharp gasp, her body going rigid. For a moment, her face twisted in agony, her eyes rolling back into her head. Then, as quickly as it began, the tension left her body and she collapsed to the ground. The figure faded into the darkness, its presence vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside Danielle, shaking her. "Danielle, wake up!" But Danielle didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half open but unfocused, staring blankly into the void. "She's alive," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what did it do to her?" No one had an answer. The group huddled around Danielle, the oppressive darkness closing in around them once more. The labyrinth had claimed another victim, and they were no closer to understanding why or how to stop it. The silence after Danielle's collapse was suffocating. The group huddled around her limp form, their flashlights casting uneven beams that barely pushed back the surrounding darkness. Eleanor knelt beside her, gripping her hand as if sheer willpower could bring her back to consciousness. Marcus stood stiffly a few feet away, his jaw clenched, scanning the tunnel with wary eyes, while Eric and Zoe whispered frantic suggestions, their voices trembling with fear. "We can't stay here," Marcus finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "Whatever that thing was, it might come back, and we don't know what else is out there." Eleanor glared up at him, her face pale and tight. "And go where, Marcus? We don't even know where we are." "Danielle needs help. Real help, not just us stumbling around in the dark." "She's breathing," Zoe added, her voice barely a whisper. "That means she can recover, right?" Eric crouched beside Eleanor, shining his flashlight over Danielle's face. Her skin was ashen, her eyes half-lidded and glassy, as though her mind had vacated her body. "This isn't just unconsciousness," he murmured. "It's like something took part of her." "Took what?" Marcus snapped, his frustration boiling over. "She's still here. We need to keep moving before it happens to someone else." Zoe rose, shaking her head. "We can't just drag her along. What if we make noise? What if it slows us down?" Eleanor stood abruptly, her fists clenched. "So what do you suggest? Leaving her behind?" "Because I won't let that happen." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when a faint noise echoed through the tunnel. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of bare feet slapping against stone. It seemed to come from every direction at once, bouncing off the jagged walls in eerie dissonance. "Do you hear that?" Zoe whispered, clutching Eric's arm. The tapping grew louder, and with it came another sound, a faint, guttural chant that seemed to weave itself into the air. The words were unintelligible, their syllables guttural and wet, but they carried an undeniable weight, pressing against the group like an invisible force. "It's getting closer," Marcus said, his voice low. He turned to Eleanor, his expression grim. "We have to move." Reluctantly, Eleanor nodded. "Eric, help me carry her. We're not leaving her behind." As they hoisted Danielle's limp body between them, the chant shifted, its tone taking on a mocking rhythm. It seemed to taunt their every step, growing louder the faster they moved. The tapping was no longer distant. It was just behind them, always just out of sight. They reached an intersection where the tunnel split into 3 paths. Marcus hesitated, his flashlight sweeping over each opening. The carvings on the walls had changed again, growing more sinister. The twisted humanoid figures now writhed in agony, their mouths gaping open as if screaming, though no sound came from the stone. "Which way?" Zoe asked, her voice rising in panic. Before Marcus could answer, Danielle stirred. A low, raspy breath escaped her lips, and her head lolled to the side. Eleanor and Eric froze, their grips tightening on her arms. "Danielle?" Eleanor whispered, leaning closer. Danielle's eyes fluttered open, but they were no longer the soft brown they had always been. They glowed faintly, a sickly green light emanating from their depths. Her lips moved, forming words that didn't match her voice. It was deeper, resonating with the same unnatural cadence as the chant in the tunnel. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her tone hollow and distant. "It demands what is owed." "Danielle?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" Her head snapped toward him, and for a moment, her face twisted into an expression of pure rage. "Run," she hissed. "It knows you." Before anyone could react, a deafening roar erupted from the tunnel behind them. The walls seemed to tremble, dust and pebbles raining down as the noise grew louder. The group froze, their terror rooting them to the spot. Then Danielle convulsed, her body jerking violently. Eleanor and Eric dropped her in shock, stepping back as she writhed on the ground. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and the green light in her eyes flared brighter before fading altogether. As suddenly as it began, the convulsion stopped. Danielle lay still, her breathing shallow but steady. The roar from the tunnel ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness. "What just happened?" Zoe whispered, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. Eleanor knelt beside Danielle, her hands trembling as she checked her pulse. She's back. I think she's okay." Marcus grabbed her shoulder, pulling her to her feet. "We don't have time to think. Whatever that roar was, it's still out there. We need to keep moving." The group hurried down the middle path, their footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. The chant and the tapping were gone, but the weight of the labyrinth pressed heavier with every step. No one spoke, their minds consumed by the same thought. The labyrinth wasn't just a maze. It was alive, and it was watching them. The group's footsteps reverberated through the tunnel, merging with the oppressive silence that wrapped around them like a shroud. The air was thick and stale, carrying an unshakable sense of wrongness. Each member of the group was locked in their own thoughts, trying to process the events that had unfolded. Danielle's chilling words, spoken in an unearthly voice, echoed in their minds. "It demands what is owed." Danielle was awake but dazed, her movements sluggish as she stumbled along with Eleanor's support. Her eyes, now dull and vacant, gave no indication of the fiery glow they had displayed minutes earlier. Every now and then, she muttered incoherent phrases, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric stayed close to her, his face etched with worry, while Marcus led the way, his flashlight beam darting across the walls. The carvings had grown even more grotesque. The figures etched into the stone now seemed to reach out, their contorted hands clawing toward the edges of the tunnel as if trying to escape. Zoe tried to avoid looking at them, but her eyes were drawn to the horrific scenes. "They're moving," she muttered, her voice trembling. Marcus stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "What did you say?" "The carvings, they're shifting," Zoe said, clutching her flashlight tightly. "I swear they weren't like this a second ago." Eric shook his head, his voice laced with frustration. "We're all seeing things. This place is playing tricks on us." Before Marcus could respond, a faint whisper brushed against their ears. It was soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, but it grew steadily louder, forming fragmented words in a language none of them recognized. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, wrapping around the group like a sinister embrace. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor whispered, her voice quaking. "We all did," Marcus replied tersely, shining his flashlight into the darkness. "Stay close. Don't stray." The whispers swelled, overlapping and twisting into a cacophony of voices. They spoke in a haunting harmony, their tones ranging from pleading to mocking. One voice rose above the rest, deep and commanding, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Leave," it bellowed, the word reverberating through the tunnel. "Leave or be claimed." Danielle froze in her tracks, her head snapping up. Her lips moved soundlessly, and then she screamed, a piercing, guttural cry that sent shivers down everyone's spine. She wrenched free of Eleanor's grip and began clawing at the walls, her nails scraping against the stone as if trying to dig her way out. "Danielle!" Eleanor cried, rushing to pull her away from the wall. Eric joined her, grabbing Danielle's arms and holding her back as she struggled and thrashed. "They're inside me!" Danielle shrieked, her voice raw with terror. "Get them out! Please, get them out!" Zoe backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hands. "What is happening to her?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Marcus stepped forward, his expression hardening. "We can't stay here. Whatever's happening to her, it's this place. We need to move now." Eleanor rounded on him, her eyes blazing. "She's not just something we can abandon. We don't even know what's happening to her." Before the argument could escalate, the whispers suddenly ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence that was almost more unsettling. Danielle stopped struggling, collapsing into Eric's arms. She was trembling, her breath shallow and ragged. "Take her," Marcus ordered, his voice low. "We need to find a safe spot to regroup. Whatever is doing this, we can't fight it standing still." They pressed on, the tunnel narrowing until it forced them to walk single file. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their labored breaths and the occasional scrape of a boot against stone. The walls seemed to close in, the carvings pressing closer, their twisted faces leering in the dim light. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. It was circular, with a low ceiling and smooth walls devoid of carvings. In the center was a pool of water, its surface unnaturally still. The group hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether to enter. "It's quiet," Zoe said cautiously, breaking the silence. "Too quiet." Eleanor glanced at Danielle, who seemed to have regained some awareness. "She needs rest. We don't have a choice." Reluctantly, they stepped into the chamber. The whispers remained absent, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered. Marcus set his backpack down and began unpacking supplies, while Eleanor and Eric laid Danielle on a blanket. Zoe knelt by the water, staring at her reflection. Something about it seemed wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. As the group settled into uneasy silence, a faint ripple spread across the pool's surface, distorting Zoe's reflection. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat as the distorted image began to shift. It wasn't her face staring back at her anymore. It was something else, something monstrous. It smiled. The chamber's suffocating silence was broken by Zoe's sharp intake of breath. She staggered back from the pool, nearly tripping over her own feet, her flashlight clattering to the ground. Her distorted reflection had vanished, replaced by her own pale, terrified face. But she could still feel its presence. The image burned into her mind like a brand. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, his voice tense. He was already on edge, scanning the chamber for threats. "The water," Zoe stammered, pointing at the still pool. "I saw something. It wasn't me." It smiled at me. Eleanor frowned, stepping closer to examine the pool. Its surface remained perfectly still, mirroring the dim light from their flashlights. "It's just water," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "This whole place is designed to mess with our heads." "No," Zoe insisted, her voice trembling. "It wasn't a trick. It was alive. It was watching me." Eric, who had been tending to Danielle, glanced over. "We're all seeing things," he muttered. "The carvings, the whispers, now this. It's the caves. They're messing with us." Marcus crossed his arms, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. "Whether it's real or not, we can't afford to lose focus. Zoe, stay away from the water. We'll rest here for a while, but we need to stay alert." As the group settled in, the tension was palpable. Danielle stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, her expression one of quiet dread. "It doesn't stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Even when I close my eyes, it's still there." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, kneeling beside her. "The whispers," Danielle said, her voice cracking. "They're inside me. They're showing me things, horrible things. People screaming, shadows moving, things that don't have faces." Her gaze darted toward the pool, and she shuddered. "And they keep saying one thing. The reflection takes what it's owed." Zoe stiffened, her hand unconsciously reaching for her flashlight. "The reflection," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric sighed, rubbing his temples. "Great. More cryptic warnings. Just what we need." Ignoring him, Marcus turned to Danielle. "What else did they show you?" he asked, his tone sharp. Danielle hesitated, her breathing shallow. "A door," she said finally. "It's deep in the caves, surrounded by carvings. It's the source. The whispers come from there." Marcus exchanged a glance with Eleanor. "If that's true, we need to find it. Maybe we can stop whatever's happening to us." Zoe shook her head vehemently. "You're insane if you think going deeper into this place is the answer. That's exactly what it wants. Do you have a better idea?" Marcus shot back, his patience wearing thin. Before Zoe could respond, a faint ripple disturbed the pool's surface again. Everyone froze, their gazes snapping to the water. This time, the ripple was accompanied by a faint glow, a soft, eerie light emanating from the pool's depths. Slowly, the glow intensified, revealing shapes beneath the surface. "Do you see that?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. The shapes grew clearer, resolving into ghostly figures. They floated just beneath the surface, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes wide with terror. Their mouths moved soundlessly, as if screaming, but no sound emerged. The group stared in horrified silence as the figures began to rise, their translucent forms pressing against the water's surface. Danielle let out a strangled cry, clutching at Eleanor's arm. "They're the ones it took," she said, her voice shaking. "They're trapped here." Eric backed away, his face pale. "This isn't real. It can't be real." The figures' mouths stopped moving, and their eyes fixed on the group. Slowly, deliberately, they raised their hands, pointing toward Zoe. The glow from the pool intensified, bathing the chamber in an unnatural light. Zoe felt a chill run down her spine as the figure's eyes locked onto her. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" Before anyone could react, the glow from the pool flared brightly, and a deafening roar filled the chamber. The group shielded their eyes as the light consumed them, leaving the room bathed in darkness once more. When the light subsided, the pool was still again, its surface undisturbed. But Zoe was gone. Zoe's disappearance left the group in stunned silence, the faint echoes of the deafening roar still ringing in their ears. The once still pool now looked as ordinary as any other shallow body of water, its ominous glow extinguished. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his voice cutting through the haze of shock. "Zoe," he called out, stepping closer to the pool's edge. His flashlight beams scanned the water, searching for any sign of her. "Zoe, answer me." "She's gone," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. She crouched by the pool, her hands shaking. "I saw it. One moment she was here, and then the light took her." Eric paced back and forth, muttering curses under his breath. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening. People don't just vanish like that." Danielle, still weak but alert, clung to Eleanor's arm, her gaze fixed on the water. "She's not gone," she said softly. "The reflection took her. She's in there." "In there?" Marcus spun to face her, his frustration mounting. "What does that even mean? Do you know what's happening, Danielle? Because the rest of us are flying blind." Danielle met his gaze, her eyes filled with an unsettling calm. "The whispers told me. The pool isn't just water, it's a doorway. It takes, but it doesn't give back. Not unless you play by its rules." Marcus turned away, running a hand through his hair. "Rules? What rules? We don't even know what we're dealing with." "We need to get out of here," Eric said, his voice rising. "We're sitting ducks in this cave. Whatever this is, it's playing with us. And leave Zoe behind?" Eleanor snapped, standing abruptly. "We can't just abandon her. She's not here anymore." Eric shot back. "Look around, Eleanor. She's gone, just like those figures in the water. We don't even know if she's alive." Marcus raised a hand, silencing the argument. "Enough. We're not leaving her behind, but we need a plan. If this pool is connected to her disappearance, then maybe there's a way to use it to bring her back." Eleanor nodded, though her expression remained grim. "We'll need to understand it first. The carvings, the whispers. There has to be a connection. Something we're missing." The group turned their attention back to the chamber, their flashlights illuminating the intricate carvings that adorned the walls. The symbols, once meaningless patterns, now seemed to pulse with an eerie significance. Eleanor traced one with her fingers, her brow furrowing in concentration. "These aren't just decorations," she murmured. "They're instructions or warnings. Look at this one." She pointed to a carving of a figure kneeling before a swirling pool, its hands raised as if in surrender. Surrounding the figure were jagged lines, resembling ripples in water. Danielle's voice broke the silence, low and hollow. "It's a ritual. The pool takes what it's owed, but it can also return. That's what they're saying." Marcus glanced at her skeptically. "And how do you know that?" Danielle hesitated, her face pale. "I don't know. I just do. The whispers, they're getting louder. Eric let out a frustrated groan. So what? Are we supposed to sacrifice someone else to get Zoe back? Is that the game? No, Danielle said firmly. Not someone else. It takes willingly. It doesn't want sacrifices. It wants participants. The words hung in the air, a chilling revelation that settled into their minds like a heavy stone. The pool wasn't just a trap. It was an invitation. But for what? They couldn't yet fathom. As the group debated their next move, a faint sound echoed through the chamber. A whisper, soft and insistent. It wasn't the disembodied murmurs they'd grown accustomed to. This voice was familiar, achingly so. Help me? It was Zoe. The whisper was unmistakable. It was Zoe's voice, faint but undeniable, carrying through the stillness of the cave like a soft breeze. The sound of her name, drawn out and pleading, hung in the air, wrapping around them, filling the space with an undeniable weight. The group froze, each one straining to hear more, to make sense of the voice that had seemingly come from nowhere. Zoe, Marcus called out, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound confident. Where are you? The silence that followed was thick with uncertainty. Zoe's voice had been so clear, so real. But no further words came, only the oppressive quiet of the cave. Eleanor stepped closer to the pool, her flashlight casting long shadows across the water's dark surface. Do you think it's really her? She asked, her tone fragile. Or is it just another trick? Danielle's expression was unreadable as she stared at the pool. It's her, she said softly. She's reaching out. Marcus gritted his teeth. We don't have time for guessing games. If Zoe is somewhere in this cave, we need to find her now. Eric, who had been pacing nervously, stopped in his tracks. But what if it's not her? What if this is just part of whatever's pulling us into this madness? We can't afford to wait and find out, Eleanor said, turning to face him. We're running out of options. Zoe wouldn't just leave us like this. The group fell silent, each person caught in their own whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, desperation, and hope all battled for dominance. But in the end, the pull to find Zoe outweighed everything else. They knew they couldn't abandon her. All right, Marcus said, his voice firm. We move out. We need to stay together. If we hear her voice again, we follow it. But no one goes off alone. Understood? Everyone nodded, their eyes steely with determination. The moment of hesitation passed, replaced by a shared sense of urgency. The group moved forward, with Marcus leading the way, the others close behind. The cave seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the walls narrowing at times, only to open up again into vast chambers where the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The further they went, the more disorienting the cave became. It felt like they were walking in circles, every tunnel, every turn, leading them deeper into the labyrinth. The sense of being watched, that strange feeling of being followed, intensified with each passing minute. We're lost, Eric muttered under his breath, his voice cracking. This place doesn't make sense. It's like it's alive, shifting around us. Eleanor glanced back at him, her face pale. We just need to focus. We're close. I know it. And then, as if in answer to her words, the whisper came again, clearer this time. Help me, Marcus. Zoe's voice, unmistakable now, sliced through the tension like a knife. But this time it was not just a whisper. It was louder, more desperate, filled with a raw, guttural sense of fear that no one could ignore. We're almost there, Marcus said, his voice resolute, though his hands clenched tightly around his flashlight. Just stay close. The walls around them seemed to pulse, as if responding to Zoe's call. A low hum vibrated through the stone, almost imperceptible, but it made the air feel charged, alive. The deeper they ventured into the cave, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The stifling darkness was now broken only by the narrow beam of their flashlights, which flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. Danielle's voice broke the silence once more. She's not alone. The words were simple, but they were enough to stop Marcus dead in his tracks. What do you mean? Danielle didn't look at him, her eyes trained ahead. There's something with her. I can feel it. Something is waiting. Marcus turned to face her, his brow furrowed. What do you sense? What's waiting? Danielle's lips parted as though to answer. But before she could speak, a sudden, piercing scream echoed from deep within the cave. It was a sound filled with terror, a sound so primal, so full of anguish, that it made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. The scream was unmistakable. It was Zoe's. Without another word, Marcus broke into a run, his footsteps heavy and fast, each one echoing off the walls as the others hurried to keep up. The scream had stopped, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. But it was enough to spur them forward, to propel them deeper into the unknown. Then ahead of them they saw it, a narrow, low opening in the wall of the cave, almost concealed by the thick shadows. A faint light flickered from within, casting distorted shapes against the walls. It was as if something was drawing them in, the light pulling them like moths to a flame. The whisper came again, but this time it was not Zoe's voice. It was something else entirely. Come closer. The voice was distorted, warped, like a million voices layered on top of one another, the words thick with malice and promise. Marcus hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stop. But his resolve hardened. Zoe was waiting on the other side. They had come too far to turn back now. He stepped forward, leading the group into the darkness. As Marcus stepped through the narrow opening, the air around him shifted. It was thick and heavy, as though the very atmosphere had changed, pressing down on him with an almost suffocating weight. The light ahead seemed to flicker like a dying flame, casting long, erratic shadows on the stone walls. The group followed closely behind him, their footfalls barely audible in the unnerving silence that had taken over. This doesn't feel right, Eric muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with unease. His flashlight beam trembled slightly, reflecting the tension that had settled in the air. But there was no turning back now. The path ahead seemed to narrow even further, drawing them inexorably toward whatever lay in wait. Ahead, the faint light flickered once more, but it wasn't just the source of light that drew their attention. It was the shapes. Strange, indistinct figures hovered at the edges of the light, their forms shifting and warping, as if they were made of the shadows themselves. The sight was disorienting, like looking into the depths of a nightmare. But the group pressed forward, their fear weighed against the desperation to find Zoe. This place, it's alive, Danielle whispered, her eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what she saw. These things, they're not just illusions. They're memories. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implication. Memories. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Was this cave somehow pulling their pasts into the present? Was it trying to show them things they had long buried deep inside? The light ahead seemed to intensify for a moment, as if beckoning them forward. But with it came the sound of whispers. They were soft at first, almost like a breeze rustling through trees. But as they ventured closer, the whispers became clearer, louder. Voices from all directions, each one calling out their names, filling the cavern with an overwhelming cacophony. Marcus! Marcus, come closer. The voice was familiar, unmistakable. It was Zoe's, but it wasn't right. The tone was too pleading, too desperate, as though something was trying to manipulate her voice, twisting it into something that wasn't hers. Marcus felt a gnawing unease in his gut, a warning that he couldn't ignore. He had come to this place searching for Zoe, but now, every instinct told him that he was walking into something far darker than he had ever anticipated. Stay alert, Marcus ordered, his voice shaking slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. Keep your eyes on the light, but don't listen to the voices. But it was too late. As they pressed deeper into the cave, the whispers became louder, more insistent. They were no longer just calling his name. They were echoing from every direction, distorting into something monstrous, something primal. It was as though the very walls of the cave were speaking, murmuring ancient secrets, twisted truths, and half-formed promises. Zoe! Eleanor shouted, her voice rising above the noise. We're coming. But the moment the words left her mouth, The ground beneath their feet trembled. A low rumble echoed through the cavern, shaking the walls and sending rocks tumbling from above. The flickering light ahead went out completely, plunging them into an even deeper darkness. The whispers fell silent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed to consume the entire space. "Move!" Marcus commanded, his voice sharp. He grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her toward him, as the others scrambled to follow suit. The shaking intensified, and the cave seemed to groan, as though it was alive, responding to their presence. It wasn't just the ground beneath them that was shifting, it was the very essence of the place. This cave wasn't a natural formation. It was a constructed maze, a deliberate trap designed to lead them deeper and deeper into its heart. The deeper they went, the more disorienting the passageways became. They no longer seemed to follow any logical path, as if the cave itself was shifting in response to their movements. Each corner turned revealed more twists and turns, more false openings that led nowhere. They had lost all sense of direction, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them, suffocating their every breath. And then, as suddenly as it had all started, the rumbling stopped. The tremors ceased. The silence was deafening, so complete that Marcus could feel the absence of sound in his bones. "Where are we?" Eleanor asked, her voice small, almost drowned out by the heavy stillness of the cave. "We're in the heart of it now," Marcus said grimly. He tried to steady his breath, his mind racing to make sense of what they had just encountered. Zoe's voice had led them this far, but now, in the silence, it felt as though the cave itself had swallowed her whole. There was no sign of her, no trace of her presence. Danielle stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the ground beneath her feet. "We're not alone," she whispered. Marcus felt a shiver run through him. He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Danielle's voice trembled as she spoke again, though her eyes were locked on something in the distance. "It's waiting. Whatever was calling us, it's not done with us yet." A chill swept through the group as the realization hit them all at once. They were no longer just searching for Zoe. They were the ones being hunted. The stillness of the cave was suffocating. Even the usual sounds of breathing, the shuffle of boots against gravel, and the occasional clink of a flashlight being adjusted seemed to be absorbed by the heavy silence that had descended on the group. The air was thick with the sense that something was watching them, observing them from the shadows, hidden behind the layers of rock and darkness. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they had passed some kind of threshold. They were no longer simply exploring a cave. They were trapped in something far more insidious. "Keep moving," Marcus muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the others or to himself. The last tremor, the way the entire cave had shuddered, had unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. His every instinct was telling him to turn back, to retrace their steps and escape the labyrinth, but there was no turning back now. The passageways had twisted into a web of false paths, each leading further into the unknown. Zoe's voice, once so clear, now seemed like a distant memory. It had disappeared completely, swallowed by the cave's disorienting grip. Eleanor walked beside him, her hand resting uneasily on her pack. Her eyes darted from side to side, every shadow, every movement in the periphery of her vision causing her heart to race. The others were similarly tense, the air thick with their collective anxiety. "Marcus," she said in a strained voice, her words barely rising above the silence. "Where are we? I mean, really, where are we?" He didn't have an answer for her. He wished he did. The path ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The sense of time was warped here, as if the cave itself was outside of any normal understanding. We're just following the path," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. It wasn't long before the group stumbled into what seemed to be a large cavern. The air was colder here, and the walls of the cave stretched up into an unseen void. In the center of the space stood a large, jagged pillar of stone, its surface covered in strange, glistening symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie, faint light. The symbols looked like no language Marcus had ever seen, but there was something about them that felt wrong, as if they had been written for an entirely different purpose, something beyond human comprehension. Danielle, who had been trailing behind, took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the pillar. "What is that?" she asked softly, her voice almost reverent. The question hung in the air, but no one had an answer. The stone formation was unnerving, but more than that, it felt wrong. Everything about it seemed out of place in the natural world. The way it glistened unnaturally, the way the symbols seemed to shift when not directly looked at. This was no ordinary cave formation. This was something intentionally crafted, something designed to evoke a reaction. "I don't know," Marcus said, his voice filled with apprehension. He motioned for everyone to stay back, but curiosity drove the group to approach anyway. It's not natural," he added, though he didn't need to. They all felt it. The oppressive weight of the air around them, the unspoken warning that this place was not to be trifled with. A sudden noise broke the heavy silence, an odd, hollow sound that echoed throughout the cavern. It was a distant thud, followed by a series of grinding noises, like the shifting of massive stones. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing about this place made sense anymore. The pillars seemed to hum, faintly vibrating as though reacting to the sound. "Get back," he shouted, his voice urgent. "Move now." Before anyone could react, the ground beneath their feet shuddered again. But this time, it wasn't just a tremor. It was the very ground itself shifting. The cavern seemed to expand, its walls pulling back, revealing what had been hidden in the shadows. And what they saw there made Marcus' blood run cold. The shadows parted, and what emerged from the darkness was not a creature, but a figure of a woman. At first, Marcus thought it was Zoe, but the resemblance was uncanny. The woman stood tall, her face obscured by a veil of darkness. She wore tattered clothes, her body thin and gaunt, but there was something undeniably familiar about her. As she stepped closer, her eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light. "Zoe," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. But the figure did not answer. It merely stepped forward, its eyes never leaving Marcus. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "Come closer," the voice beckoned. "It is your time." Marcus' heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't Zoe. This was something else, something that had taken her form. A chill ran down his spine as he realized what was happening. The cave wasn't just manipulating their surroundings. It was pulling them into a trap. This woman, this thing, wasn't calling them here. It was drawing them deeper into the cave's twisted depths, to some fate far worse than they could comprehend. "Don't listen to it," Marcus said sharply, his voice cutting through the dissonant whispers. He stepped forward, his feet sinking into the uneven ground, the air around him growing thicker with each movement. The figure didn't move, but continued to watch him, its eyes burning with an intensity that felt like it could pierce his very soul. Behind him, the others were frozen in place, their bodies tense, unable to tear their gazes away from the figure that had emerged from the darkness. It was too late to turn back, but Marcus wasn't sure there was any point in trying to escape now. The cave was alive, and it was playing them like pawns in a much larger game. But what was its goal? Why had it led them here? The figure lifted a hand, pointing directly at Marcus. "Your journey ends here," it said, its voice cold and final. The cave around them felt alive in a way that defied logic, its very existence pressing in on them with an oppressive weight. The stone walls that had once felt like a natural formation now seemed more like a living organism, breathing and shifting with each movement they made. Marcus felt the subtle vibrations in the ground beneath his feet, as though the earth itself was reacting to their presence, watching them, waiting for something. The figure before them, the one that had once been Zoe, or at least a twisted mockery of her, continued to stand motionless. Its eyes, glowing faintly with an unnatural light, never left Marcus. Every breath he took seemed to resonate with the very pulse of the cave. The weight of the atmosphere felt unbearable, like the walls were closing in around them. He could hear the distant echoes of the group's heavy breathing, but no one dared to speak, as if afraid that any words might provoke the wrong reaction. The whispers that had been faint at first grew louder, like a chorus of voices all speaking in different tongues, overlapping each other in a maddening symphony. Each word seemed to reverberate through the very core of his being, sending shivers down his spine. They were calling to him, beckoning him forward, urging him to approach the figure that stood before them. But something inside him screamed to resist. This wasn't Zoe. It couldn't be. There was something malevolent here, something ancient and dark, woven into the fabric of the cave itself. The whispers became more insistent, their tone shifting from beckoning to commanding. "Come closer," they demanded, but Marcus stood his ground. He had no intention of giving in, not yet. His hands clenched in a fist at his sides, his knuckles white, as he took slow, deliberate steps backward. The others seemed paralyzed, their eyes glued to the figure that still stood silently before them. "Marcus!" Eleanor's voice trembled, her gaze never leaving the figure. "Well, what is that thing? Is that really her?" The words were barely more than a whisper, but they held a mixture of dread and hope. The woman, the thing, before them seemed to draw the light from the air, creating an eerie, almost suffocating atmosphere. Marcus swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. "No, it's not Zoe." His voice was a hoarse whisper, barely louder than the growing whispers that filled the cavern. "It's something else, something that's pretending to be her." Danielle's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She looked as though she was about to break down completely. "What do we do? What do we?" Before she could finish, the ground beneath them trembled again, this time more violently. The entire cavern seemed to shudder, as if some unseen force was trying to force them to move. The air thickened, and a low, rumbling noise filled the space. The walls of the cave began to shift, grinding against each other in a slow, deliberate motion. It was as though the entire structure was alive, and they were nothing more than intruders. Suddenly, the figure before them moved, its body jerking in an unnatural manner. It seemed to stretch and distort as it stepped forward, its form shifting with every movement. The once clear outline of a human figure became more distorted, more inhuman, its limbs elongating grotesquely, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around it. The whispers crescendoed, now a cacophony of shrill voices, each one blending into the other until they formed a single, unified scream. Marcus's chest tightened as the ground beneath him seemed to pull him toward the figure, as if the cave itself was trying to drag him forward. The air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling in the pit of his stomach grew stronger. He fought to resist the pull, but it was as if the very walls were conspiring against him. "Run!" he shouted, though his voice felt distant, as if the words were being stolen by the cave itself. He turned to the others, but their feet remained rooted to the ground, as though they were no longer in control of their own bodies. The terror that had gripped them all was now more than just fear. It was as if the cave was controlling their very thoughts, twisting their minds, urging them to surrender. The figure took another step forward, its face now fully revealed in the faint glow of the symbols carved into the stone. It was no longer Zoe, but something darker. Its face was gaunt and hollow, its skin stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes, those glowing eyes, were full of an unholy hunger. It opened its mouth, and the whispers grew louder, no longer a distant echo, but a single unified voice that echoed within their very minds. "You have come too far," the voice intoned, its sound impossibly deep and resonant, reverberating through Marcus's bones. "You are part of it now. There is no escape." A cold sweat broke out on Marcus's forehead as he realized the full extent of their situation. The cave wasn't just a maze of stone. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were its prey. This figure, whatever it was its agent. It had been waiting for them, drawing them deeper into its labyrinth with each step they took. Marcus felt the pressure build in his chest. And for the first time since entering the cave, he understood what the whispers truly meant. They weren't calling to him. They were consuming him, pulling him into the darkness. The walls of the cave were closing in, and there was no way out. In that moment, he made a decision. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, but he could no longer afford to worry about them. The time for hesitation was over. The cave had trapped them all, and the only way out was to break free from its grip, to escape whatever dark force was pulling them into its depths. He glanced one last time at the shifting figure before him, his heart pounding in his chest, and he turned to run. But as he took that first step, the walls of the cavern moved again, cutting off his path. The stone blocked his way, trapping him in a dead end. The whispers grew louder, the air growing more suffocating with each passing second. There was no escape. The walls were weeping. The walls pressed in around them, not physically but mentally, creating an unrelenting, suffocating atmosphere. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to tremble with a rhythm of their own, almost as if they were alive. As Marcus stood frozen in place, trying to comprehend the full horror of their situation, his mind raced for any possibility of escape. But the deeper they went into the labyrinth, the more it felt as though the very stone and earth around them had been designed not to contain, but to consume. The sound of Danielle's panicked breathing filled the cavern, and her voice broke through the haunting silence. "What is this place? Why can't we get out?" Her words were shaky, drenched in fear. As she spoke, Marcus realized that their chances of escape were growing slimmer by the second. The labyrinth seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, every path leading only to more twists and turns that looped back on themselves. There was no clear way forward, no safe passage to retrace their steps. "We're trapped," Marcus muttered, his voice hollow, echoing against the stone. It was a cold realization, and one that sent a ripple of dread through the group. The echoes of their voices bounced off the walls, but they didn't return as they should. The sounds were muffled, as though absorbed by something deeper within the cave. It was almost as though the labyrinth itself had begun to swallow their voices, as if to erase all trace of their existence within its confines. The figure that had once been Zoe, if it could still be called that, stood motionless in the distance, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It hadn't moved since its last appearance, but its presence seemed to linger in the air, suffocating them with its unnatural stillness. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them, studying them, waiting for something. What was it? Why hadn't it attacked? The uncertainty gnawed at him, threatening to unravel what little composure he had left. "We need to keep moving," Eleanor said, her voice tight with fear. She was the first to break the silence, and her words carried the weight of necessity. "There has to be a way out. We can't just stand here." Her eyes flickered toward the others, but there was a desperation in her gaze, a fragility that hadn't been there before. Marcus wanted to believe her, wanted to think that there was some escape waiting for them if they just kept moving forward. But the deeper they went, the more the cave seemed to shift, its very nature betraying them. The paths grew more disorienting, looping back on themselves, twisting in ways that defied logic. The walls around them pulsed as though breathing, and each step they took only seemed to sink them further into its grasp. The whispers began again, faint at first, like a distant murmur on the edge of hearing. But this time there was something different. The voices weren't speaking to him, or to any of them individually. They were speaking through him, echoing inside his mind. The words they whispered didn't come from any physical source, but seemed to emanate from the very walls of the labyrinth itself. "You will never leave," the voice hissed, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very stone. "You are part of us now." The ground beneath them seemed to shift once more, as though the labyrinth was alive, and the realization began to settle in. This place wasn't a mere collection of tunnels. It was a sentient entity, a being with its own desires, its own hunger. The walls weren't just stone. They were the skin of something far older, far more ancient. The labyrinth itself was alive, and it was feeding on them, drawing them deeper into its grasp, one step at a time. Marcus turned to the group, his eyes wild with fear. "We have to move faster. We can't stay here." His voice was ragged, worn with exhaustion and terror, but he knew that standing still would only make things worse. As if to prove his point, the ground shook beneath them, and the cavern seemed to come alive with an unholy energy. The walls groaned, and the air was thick with the oppressive sense of something watching, something waiting. "Where do we go?" Danielle asked, her voice trembling. "Which way?" Marcus glanced at the 3 paths ahead of them, each one looking equally foreboding. None of them seemed to lead to anything other than more stone, more darkness. Yet they had to choose. There was no other option. He reached for the first tunnel, the one to his left, the one that seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible glow. "This way," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. He didn't know if it was the right choice, but it was the only choice they had left. The others, though hesitant, followed him, and together they plunged into the unknown, each step echoing louder than the last. But as they moved deeper, the whispers began again, growing louder and more frantic. They weren't just speaking anymore. They were screaming, shrieking words that burned into his mind. "You belong here. Forever." Marcus wanted to stop, to scream, to demand answers from the walls themselves. But he knew that the moment they stopped moving, the cave would claim them. There was no way out. Not really. The stone beneath their feet seemed to shift again, this time with a sudden, violent jolt. It was as though the labyrinth itself had awakened, furious at their intrusion. The walls closed in on them, and Marcus barely had time to shout a warning before the floor beneath them crumbled away. They were falling. As Marcus fell, his body weightless and disoriented, there was no sense of time, only the disorienting sensation of being drawn deeper into the labyrinth. The walls blurred around him, and for a moment, he couldn't tell whether he was being swallowed by the earth itself or if the ground was simply giving way beneath him. The screams of his team echoed around him, though their voices seemed muted by the oppressive weight of the darkness. It was as if the very air around them was thickening, swallowing sound and light. When he finally hit the ground, it wasn't as painful as he expected. Instead, it was more of a soft, almost absorbing thud, as though the ground itself had decided to catch him, or perhaps cradle him. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, he lay there, trying to gather his bearings, wondering if he had somehow fallen into some kind of hellish dream. The others landed in various positions around him, groaning in pain, but also in confusion. Eleanor was the first to sit up, her hands clutching the dirt beneath her as though to steady herself against an invisible force. "Where are we?" Her voice was barely a whisper, as though the words might disrupt the strange, eerie quiet that surrounded them. The others struggled to their feet. Danielle and Zoe seemed to shake off their disorientation quicker, while Marcus lingered on the ground, trying to comprehend what had just happened. It was difficult to see, the darkness pressing in on them from every direction, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized that they were no longer in a familiar part of the labyrinth. The stone walls had become jagged, almost as if they had been hewn by some ancient hand. The very air felt different, denser, heavier, and somehow older. "This place," Zoe began, her voice barely audible. "It's like it was built or carved by something not human." Marcus glanced around. The cavern they had fallen into was vast, and the walls seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The shadows clung to the edges of the space, making it impossible to see where the walls ended and the void began. It wasn't just a cave. It was something far older, something designed not just to house the researchers, but to keep them. The very space they occupied felt sentient, as if it had been waiting for them. They could hear nothing except for the occasional scrape of their boots against the stone, the sound of breath drawn too quickly, too shallow. For a moment, it felt as though they were the last humans left on the planet, stranded in a world where nothing moved except the darkness itself. Marcus felt the weight of his own thoughts pressing on him, the oppressive quiet gnawing at his mind. "What are we supposed to do now?" Danielle asked, her voice a mixture of frustration and fear. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, shaking his head. "We can't stand here and wonder. We need to keep moving." But as he spoke, something shifted in the air. A subtle change, imperceptible at first, but unmistakable when he stopped to listen. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or the rustling of the cave around them. No, it was something far more insidious. It was the feeling of being watched, a sensation that crawled under the skin and made every hair on his body stand on end. "We're not alone," Marcus muttered, barely able to form the words. It wasn't the usual fear that accompanied the unknown. It was something more, something primal and ancient. Zoe moved closer to him, her expression strained. "Do you feel it too? It's like the walls are alive." Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The others could feel it too. The quiet had become oppressive, not in the way it had been before, but in a way that suggested something was waiting, watching, as if the labyrinth had suddenly grown aware of their presence, becoming more alert, more conscious. The silence was broken by the sudden sound of a distant scraping. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there just beneath the surface of their consciousness. Marcus held up his hand, signaling for the others to stay quiet. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse from the pressure. The sound grew louder, closer, but it wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was something much worse. The sound of something dragging against stone, something heavy and relentless, like a massive weight being pulled toward them. "We need to move. Now!" Marcus shouted, and without another word, the group broke into a sprint. The shadows seemed to elongate in the dim light, stretching unnaturally, as if they were being manipulated by an unseen force. The deeper they ran, the more the labyrinth seemed to pulse with energy, the walls throbbing with each step they took. Every instinct in Marcus screamed at him to stop, to turn and fight whatever was coming, but he knew that survival now depended on moving forward. They had to outrun whatever was hunting them. But as they ran, the scraping sound continued, growing louder and closer, until it was impossible to tell whether the walls themselves were closing in or if something else was chasing them from behind. Suddenly, Zoe let out a scream, and Marcus turned to see her stumble and fall. As he moved to help her up, a shadow, no longer just a trick of the light, but a solid form, appeared before them. It was massive, a hulking figure cloaked in darkness, its shape impossible to fully comprehend, as though it existed partially outside of reality itself. The air grew cold, and with it came the distinct feeling that they were no longer in control. The labyrinth had them, and whatever was chasing them was just the beginning of a nightmare that they would never escape. The shadow that loomed before them felt more like a living thing than an apparition. As Marcus stared into the inky depths of the figure, the hairs on his neck stood on end. The creature, or whatever it was, did not have a clear shape, yet its presence was undeniable, suffocating. It seemed to pulse with an energy that vibrated through the air, and Marcus felt a coldness seeping into his bones. He tried to move, tried to react, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place by an unknown terror. Zoe, still on the ground, scrambled backward, her breath shallow and erratic. The others were just as paralyzed, all of them caught in a moment of primal fear. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the feeling of being hunted, of being stalked by something ancient that had no reason to exist but to erase them. Marcus's pulse raced in his ears, drowning out the scraping noise that still echoed in the distance. "What is that?" Danielle whispered, her voice trembling with fear. It was a question that didn't need an answer, for no one knew. The creature's form shifted subtly, as if it was constantly evolving, adapting to the darkness. Its edges blurred, its shape defied logic, and yet it was undeniably real. It wasn't just a trick of the mind, it was something tangible, and it was waiting for them to make a move. The silence in the cavern deepened, hanging heavily over them. The scraping sound that had accompanied them earlier seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. The walls of the labyrinth, once alive with movement, now felt like a tomb, as though the very stone had turned its attention to them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to thrum, as if it too had a heartbeat. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest. In that moment, Marcus realized that the labyrinth itself had a will. It was not merely a series of tunnels and chambers. It was alive, and it had been waiting for them. They weren't just lost in a maze, they had fallen into a trap, The walls, the shadows, the very floor beneath them. It was all part of something much larger, something far older and more malevolent than they had ever imagined. "Move!" Marcus shouted, finally breaking the paralysis that had gripped them. His command seemed to snap the others into action, but it was too late. The creature, or whatever it was, began to move, its form shifting with terrifying fluidity. It glided forward, closing the distance between them faster than they could run. The first one to fall was Danielle. As she turned to flee, her foot slipped on the uneven ground, sending her crashing to the stone floor. Before anyone could reach her, the shadow enveloped her, a gust of cold air surrounding her body as she screamed. But her voice was quickly silenced, swallowed by the darkness. Zoe screamed too, but Marcus couldn't look back. They had no time to waste. They had to keep moving. The labyrinth had become a hunter, and they were its prey. He grabbed Eleanor's arm and pulled her toward an opening in the rock that seemed to appear from nowhere, a crack in the wall that promised a possible escape. He didn't know where it led, but it was better than standing still. The others followed, their steps frantic, echoing off the stone as they raced through the twisting corridors. But no matter how fast they ran, the air seemed to grow colder, thicker, and the shadows seemed to follow them, not with physical form, but with a presence that surrounded them, a suffocating pressure. It was as if the labyrinth was closing in on them, its very walls shifting to trap them within. In a way, it wasn't just the entity that hunted them now. It was the labyrinth itself. It had become a living, breathing thing, a force that was alive with intent. The more they ran, the more they could feel it tightening its grip, drawing them deeper into its embrace. Marcus could feel his legs burning, exhaustion seeping into his every muscle, but still, he pushed forward. His mind was clear, focused, driven by the primal urge to survive. They had no choice now. There was no turning back. The entity, the labyrinth, the very forces of the earth itself, it was all closing in on them. And the only thing they could do was run. But then, just as hope began to wane, a new sound emerged. It was distant at first, a faint humming, almost melodic in nature. It seemed to ripple through the stone like an echo from another world. The sound was soft, a strange contrast to the terror that had filled the labyrinth moments before. Marcus stopped for a split second, his breath catching in his throat. The others paused too, uncertainty written on their faces. What was this sound? Was it a sign of hope, or another part of the labyrinth's twisted game? Eleanor glanced toward Marcus, her eyes wide with confusion. "What is that?" Marcus swallowed, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "I don't know," he said, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't the entity. It wasn't the crawling darkness that pursued them. The sound seemed to offer something different, something unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting in its resonance. But in the depths of his soul, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was yet another trap, another layer of the labyrinth's twisted web. Still, there was no choice but to follow it. Whatever the source of the humming was, it was their only hope. The labyrinth was alive, yes, but so too was the sound. And in this strange, deadly game, anything that wasn't the entity or the walls was worth pursuing. They began to move toward the humming sound, the air growing colder with each step. Marcus couldn't help but wonder if it would be the salvation they so desperately sought, or if it was yet another illusion, another step into the abyss. As they moved toward the mysterious humming, an oppressive silence seemed to fall over the labyrinth. The walls felt closer, their surfaces pressed in against their skin as though the very stone was watching them. With every step, the humming grew louder, more distinct, reverberating through the corridors like the low thrumming of an ancient heart. It was unlike anything they had heard before, otherworldly and yet strangely familiar. The noise pulsed in time with the erratic beats of their hearts, as though the labyrinth and their very souls were beginning to sync with its rhythm. Marcus's mind raced, torn between the undeniable allure of the sound and the fear gnawing at his gut. What could it be? Where was it leading them? There was no clear answer, no indication that any of them were heading towards safety. Each turn in the maze felt more like a descent deeper into the unknown. The cracks in the stone widened, and the air grew colder still. The humming was now a constant presence in the background, pushing them forward with an almost magnetic force. What if it's another trap? Zoe's voice broke the silence, her words hanging heavy in the stillness. What if this is just another part of its game? Marcus turned to face her, his expression grim. We don't have any other choice. Whatever this is, it's the only lead we've got. We have to keep moving. The others nodded in reluctant agreement, though none of them seemed entirely convinced. They pressed on, the rhythmic humming growing louder until it was nearly deafening. The labyrinth seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in tighter with each step, as if the stone itself was trying to keep them from reaching the source of the sound. Their surroundings became claustrophobic, and the tension between the walls and their own fear was palpable. The path ahead remained uncertain, the corridors twisting in seemingly impossible directions, leading them deeper into the heart of the labyrinth. Yet there was something almost comforting about the sound, a presence that seemed to offer solace amidst the madness. It was as though the humming was a thread, guiding them towards something, towards some unknown truth that had eluded them for so long. It was as if the labyrinth itself was not only a maze of stone, but a puzzle of memory and forgotten time. Eventually, they arrived at an open chamber. The air here felt different, not colder or more oppressive, but still thick with anticipation. In the center of the room, there was a large stone altar, ancient and worn by time, its surface covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. The humming emanated from the altar itself, as if the stone had absorbed the sound, channeling it through its cracks and grooves. Marcus took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The altar seemed to pulse in time with the humming, as though it were alive, its very stone vibrating with the force of the sound. As he approached, he noticed something else, a series of markings on the floor surrounding the altar. The markings appeared to form a circle, as though someone had once performed some sort of ritual here, a ritual that involved this very humming. "Do you think this is it?" Danielle whispered, her voice reverberating slightly as though the room itself was alive with sound. Before anyone could respond, a low, distorted voice broke through the humming, so quiet at first that they almost didn't hear it. But then, it grew louder, more distinct, each word clear and heavy with intent. Leave this place." The voice was soft, but its power was unmistakable. "You are not meant to be here." The group froze, their eyes scanning the room for the source of the voice. But the chamber was empty, save for the altar and the strange symbols on the floor. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing through their minds rather than through the air. Zoe stepped back, visibly shaken. "Did you hear that?" Marcus nodded slowly, his pulse quickening. "I heard it, but there's no one here." The humming continued, undisturbed by the voice, as if the sound had its own consciousness, indifferent to the warning that had just been spoken. The voice, while chilling, didn't seem to be directed at them with malicious intent. Rather, it felt like a plea, a desperate whisper from the past, warning them of some great danger. Yet, despite the warning, there was something inside Marcus that urged him to stay, to examine the altar more closely. "It's a warning," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the terror that lingered in the air. "But what are we supposed to do? Turn back now, after everything we've been through?" The others exchanged uncertain glances. They were at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. They had ventured this far, and now they were faced with a choice. Heed the warning and retreat, or push forward into the unknown, risking whatever consequences that might bring. Marcus studied the altar, his eyes drawn to the symbols etched into its surface. They were familiar, yet not in a way he could place. They seemed to draw him in, pulling at some deep, forgotten part of his mind. He reached out slowly, his fingers grazing the rough stone. The moment his hand touched the surface, the humming changed. It deepened, becoming a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. A shiver ran down his spine as the room around them seemed to shift. The walls creaked, and for a brief moment, the air grew thick with an unbearable pressure. It was as if something deep within the earth had stirred, A sense of foreboding flooded his senses, as though they had awoken something far older than the labyrinth itself. Suddenly, the voice returned, but this time, it was more urgent, more desperate. "You must leave now, before it comes." The message was clear. Whatever force had made the labyrinth its home, whatever entity had whispered to them through the humming, was no longer content with silence. It was waking. The air in the chamber was thick with tension. The group stood frozen, their eyes darting between the strange symbols etched into the altar and the walls that seemed to close in around them. The warning from the voice echoed in their minds. "Leave now, before it comes." It was impossible to ignore the urgency palpable in the words. And yet, the humming continued, steady, insistent, as though it were unaffected by the growing sense of dread that clung to the group like a second skin. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The voice, though faint and distant, was still there, resonating in his thoughts. He wanted to turn back, to retreat from the unknown. But the pull of the altar, the strange symbols, and the humming was stronger than his fear. There was something here, something that called to him, that beckoned him deeper into the labyrinth. The thought of abandoning the journey now, after all they had endured, felt like a betrayal. "It's getting worse," Zoe said, her voice trembling. "We need to go. We've been warned. We don't know what we're dealing with." But Marcus shook his head slowly. "We're too close to the answer now. I can feel it. The source of the sound, the reason we're here, it's all connected." Eleanor stepped closer to Marcus, her expression one of concern. "Marcus, you don't know what this is. What if it's not just a warning? What if it's a trap?" Her words hit him like a splash of cold water. Was this all a trap? Was the labyrinth, with its winding corridors and cryptic messages, nothing more than an elaborate snare meant to trap them in its depths? The thought was enough to send a chill down his spine. But the altar, the symbols, the voice, they felt too important to ignore. "I know it feels like a trap," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But something about this place, it's like it's calling us. I can't explain it, but we have to see this through." Zoe let out a frustrated sigh, clearly torn between fear and curiosity. "This isn't some ancient riddle to solve. This is real, Marcus. People have disappeared down here before. We can't ignore that." But even as she spoke, the humming seemed to intensify, and the room itself seemed to vibrate in response. The symbols on the altar shimmered, their shapes shifting as if alive, moving and undulating before their eyes. A sudden jolt of energy surged through the chamber, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. It was subtle at first, a soft vibration that grew into something far more intense, like the low growl of an unseen beast. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, their surfaces quivering in sync with the humming. Marcus stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice, once distant, now felt like it was directly in his ear, its tone urgent, almost pleading. "It's awakening." The words hung in the air, hanging heavy like a shroud. Something was stirring, something that had lain dormant for centuries, perhaps longer. The labyrinth, which had once been a maze of forgotten passages and hidden chambers, was now alive with a malevolent energy. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, the stones shifting ever so slightly, as though the entire structure was a living organism, reacting to their presence. "Get away from it!" Zoe screamed, her eyes wide with terror. She grabbed Marcus's arm and tried to pull him away from the altar, but he resisted, his gaze fixed on the symbols. The pulsing energy was intoxicating, a force that seemed to flood his mind with images, with memories, with fragments of forgotten history. The symbols on the altar were no longer just markings in stone. They were a language that his mind was only beginning to understand. He could hear whispers, faint and distant, as if the stone itself were speaking to him. A sudden roar echoed through the labyrinth, a deafening, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. The humming intensified, growing louder and more chaotic, its once rhythmic beat now erratic and frenzied. The stone altar began to crack, deep fissures spreading across its surface like veins of blackened blood. "It's too late," Eleanor whispered, her face pale. It's already begun. Marcus felt a sharp sting in his chest, as though the labyrinth itself were reaching out and grabbing hold of him. He stumbled backward, his vision swimming as the chamber seemed to warp and twist. The symbols on the altar glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light, casting long shadows on the walls. The sound of the humming was now accompanied by something else, an indistinct, high-pitched noise that grated on the nerves, like the scraping of metal against stone. Then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The chamber fell into a deathly silence, the oppressive energy still hanging in the air. For a long moment, none of them moved, their breath caught in their throats as they waited for the next move, the next sound, the next shift. It was Marcus who broke the silence, his voice hoarse. We can't turn back now. Whatever's down here, whatever's awake, it's here with us. Zoe, her face ashen, nodded reluctantly. What do we do now? Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. We keep going. We've come too far to stop now. We're part of this now. We have to find out what it wants. The labyrinth was no longer just a series of twisting tunnels and hidden chambers. It was a living, breathing entity, one that had stirred from its long slumber. And as Marcus and his team stepped deeper into its heart, they could feel its presence watching them, waiting for them to unravel its secrets or become its next victims. The silence after the altar's awakening was suffocating. For what felt like hours, the group stood motionless, the weight of the unseen force pressing down on them with every breath they took. Marcus, Zoe, Eleanor, and the others were each trapped in their thoughts, struggling to process what had just happened. It was as if time had slowed, the seconds stretching into infinity as they waited for something, anything, to break the oppressive stillness. And yet, as the moments passed, nothing came. The walls of the labyrinth seemed to hold their breath as well, the soft vibrations from the altar fading into a strange, unnerving calm. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The labyrinth had changed. Whatever ancient force had been awakened was now aware of them, and it was watching, waiting. The symbols, once abstract and inscrutable, now seemed to pulse with life, their meaning clearer but more dangerous than ever. He could sense their power, raw, chaotic, and far beyond anything he had encountered before. Every fiber of his being told him to leave, to run back through the tunnels and out into the safety of the world above. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was impossible. There was no turning back now. We need to decide what to do. Eleanor's voice cut through the silence. She had remained quiet up until now, her wide eyes reflecting the terror that had overtaken her, but the practicality in her tone made it clear that she wasn't willing to sit idle any longer. We can't just stand here. We have to make a choice. Zoe nodded slowly. The voice, it said something about awakening. The altar, the symbols, they're part of it. Whatever's down here, whatever we've stirred, it's only going to get worse. Marcus glanced at the group, his mind racing. They had come so far, faced so many dangers, but nothing had prepared them for this moment. The labyrinth had always been a place of mystery, but now it was a place of terror, alive with ancient forces and unknown powers. And yet, Marcus felt a pull, an insatiable urge to push forward. There was something deeper, something at the heart of the maze that was calling him. He couldn't explain it, but he couldn't ignore it either. We can't just leave, he said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the chaos inside his chest. Whatever it is, we need to face it. There's something here that we need to understand. We've been brought here for a reason. Zoe's expression hardened, but there was doubt in her eyes. We don't even know what we're dealing with, Marcus. We don't know if we can stop whatever this is. Her hand clenched at her side, her knuckles white. Maybe we should have never come down here. I don't think it's a matter of stopping it, Marcus said, his voice lowering. He could feel the weight of his own words, as if saying them aloud was sealing some kind of fate. It's about understanding it. We're part of this now. We've opened something, and we need to figure out what it is before it consumes us. Eleanor turned to look at him, her gaze sharp. And what happens if we don't? What happens if we're not able to understand it? If we just keep going forward without knowing what it really is? Marcus swallowed hard. The reality of what they faced was setting in. It wasn't just about solving a puzzle anymore. It was about surviving. The labyrinth, the altar, the hum, the voice. It was all tied to something far greater, something that perhaps none of them were prepared for. The force they had awakened was not just a relic of the past. It was alive, a sentient power that had been dormant for centuries. And now it had been roused. I don't know, Marcus admitted, his voice soft. But we have no choice but to keep moving forward. We can't turn back. Not now. The others were silent for a long moment. Zoe's expression was torn, her face flushed with a mix of fear and frustration. Eleanor's eyes flicked between Marcus and the symbols, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. But despite their fear, despite the nagging doubts, there was something in their eyes, something that recognized the truth of Marcus's words. They couldn't stop now. They had already crossed the threshold. The labyrinth seemed to respond to their decision. The silence was broken by a low rumble, the ground beneath their feet trembling once more. The walls shifted again, their stones groaning as though the very structure of the maze was alive. A cold wind swept through the chamber, carrying with it an ancient scent, something faintly familiar but wrong, like the dust of forgotten centuries. The symbols on the altar flared to life once more, their glow casting flickering shadows across the group's faces. "We have to go deeper," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "There's something more down there. The answer we're looking for. It's at the heart of this place." A voice echoed in his mind, soft and distant. "Do you really want to know?" It wasn't the voice from before, the one that had warned them to leave. This voice was different, familiar yet unknowable. It spoke not in words but in feelings, impressions, as though the labyrinth itself was asking him if he was ready for the truth. He froze, the weight of the question settling heavily on his shoulders. But there was no turning back. There was only the path forward. "I'm ready," Marcus said quietly, even though the voice within him whispered doubts. He had no idea what lay ahead, but the pull of the labyrinth was too strong, the need for answers too great. Whatever it was that awaited them in the depths, they had no choice but to face it. Together, with a final glance at the altar, the group took their first steps deeper into the heart of the labyrinth, unaware of the horrors that awaited them, or the revelations that would shatter everything they thought they knew. The maze had awakened, and it was about to show them what it truly wanted. As the group descended further into the labyrinth, the air thickened, heavy with an ancient presence that seemed to pull at their very souls. The walls, once merely curious remnants of a forgotten era, now felt like sentient beings, observing and judging. Each step echoed in the vast emptiness, a constant reminder that they were moving into the unknown, beyond the point of no return. Marcus led the way, his mind consumed with the same driving force that had haunted him from the moment they had entered this place, an insatiable need to uncover the truth. But with every turn, the labyrinth seemed to grow more malevolent, its corridors twisting into impossible configurations, its depths unraveling the fabric of reason itself. Eleanor's voice broke the silence, a thin tremor in her words. "Marcus, we're not just looking for answers anymore, are we? This feels wrong, like we're being drawn into something that doesn't want us here." Her eyes flicked nervously toward the flickering shadows cast by their lanterns, each movement magnifying the sense of being watched. Marcus halted for a moment, considering her words. He had felt it too, the growing pressure, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The labyrinth was no longer a structure built by ancient hands. It had become something living, breathing, and aware. It knew them, recognized them, and it had been waiting. "I don't know," he finally replied, his voice strained. "But we can't stop now. We're too deep into it." Zoe, her eyes haunted by the same fear that gripped them all, stepped up beside him. "You said we had no choice. But what if we're wrong? What if what we find down here, it's not something we can control? What if we're meant to stay trapped?" Marcus couldn't deny the logic in her words. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. What if their pursuit of knowledge had been a mistake? What if the labyrinth wasn't meant to be understood, but feared and avoided? Yet, in his heart, he knew the answer was already set in motion. The decisions they made here, however misguided or reckless, had brought them to this point. There was no turning back. There was only forward. And forward they went, the labyrinth's twists and turns becoming more erratic, more disorienting. At times, the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythmic beat, as if the heart of the maze was alive. The symbols that had once glowed faintly now burned with an otherworldly intensity, illuminating passages that led to nowhere, or perhaps to places even more dangerous. Every few steps, the ground beneath them shifted, as if it were alive, testing their resolve. Then they reached the heart of the labyrinth. The chamber was vast, impossibly so. It defied the dimensions of the labyrinth, stretching far beyond the limits of the tunnels they had traversed. In the center stood the altar, now throbbing with a grotesque energy, its ancient carvings glowing with an unholy radiance. The air hummed, vibrating with an unnatural force that seemed to reverberate deep within their bones. And around the altar, etched into the stone floor, were more symbols. Symbols that Marcus now recognized as a map, a guide to the labyrinth's true purpose. "This is it," he whispered, though his voice sounded distant, as though someone else were speaking. The pull, the call of the altar, was undeniable now. He could feel it in his chest, in his very being. The answers were here, just beyond reach, waiting to be uncovered. But as he stepped forward, the ground trembled. The walls cracked. The labyrinth itself seemed to scream in agony, a noise that reverberated through their very souls. And then, in an instant, the realization hit him. The labyrinth was not merely a place. It was a prison for something ancient, something powerful, something that had been contained for eons, waiting for this moment of release. "No!" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, but it held the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "What have we done?" In that moment, the altar's light exploded into a blinding radiance, and the labyrinth seemed to collapse inward, the walls bending and warping as though they were made of nothing but smoke and shadows. The symbols on the floor began to shift, rearranging themselves, revealing an image, a figure. The figure was human, but not quite. Its form was twisted, broken, an amalgamation of forgotten nightmares. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural fire, and it turned its gaze upon them, recognizing their presence. For a split second, Marcus saw what it truly was, something born from the very depths of the labyrinth, something that had been waiting for its release. The figure was the labyrinth itself, and now it had awakened, free to roam the world once again. Its presence suffocated the air, pressing down on them with a weight that made it hard to breathe, to think. Zoe screamed as the darkness seemed to engulf them. The walls of the labyrinth began to bleed, the very stones oozing a black substance that spread across the floor like a tidal wave. The ground cracked open beneath their feet, and the altar's light pulsed with a deafening roar, shaking the chamber to its foundations. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just an eerie silence that stretched out into infinity. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged as he searched the darkened space around them. Had it all been a hallucination? Had the labyrinth finally broken him, warped his mind with its ancient power? But then, the figure reappeared. It was standing in front of them now, its form shifting and coiling like smoke, its eyes filled with an impossible, unholy knowledge. It was no longer bound by the labyrinth. It had become the labyrinth. And in that instant, Marcus understood. They were not meant to solve its mysteries. They were meant to be its prisoners, its final sacrifice. And just as he was about to scream, to run, the labyrinth consumed them.